American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 11, Political Participation and Voting Behavior. In this segment, we'll be considering multiple different learning objectives. First, we'll be understanding how political participation upholds core democratic principles. We'll also be describing several forms of political participation, summarizing voter turnout patterns, and discussing the factors that affect turnout, and then finally discussing the various barriers to voting in U.S. elections. So let's get started. First of all, when we talk about political participation, we have to consider what the value of it is. Political participation is the process by which opinion is turned into action. In other words, it accomplishes the very important thing of who gets what. This is the primary means by which the people's will is connected to government actions. As a result, it upholds the democratic principles of political freedom and majority rule. So let's take a look at some forms of political participation, of which there are four general categories. The first is voting, and this is pretty much obvious in the sense that, yes, people vote and that's how they make their will heard in a very systematic manner. But there are also those campaign activities such as going door to door, putting a bumper sticker in your car, signs out in front, and so on and so forth. There's also citizen-initiated contact with government officials, going to your government officials and talking to them about the issues. It matters. And finally, there are local community activities in which individuals get involved with governance in that manner. When we look at the different forms of political participation, this is a great study by Smith et al. It suggests that voting is utilized by about 60% of the population, and after that it diminishes to around 30% with signing of petitions, contacting government officials, and it diminishes even more until we see a very small proportion of the population attend an organized protest. Now, this might actually reflect that the system works when fewer people are engaging in more extreme political activities. Now, comparatively, though, we see that the United States has less voting and more non-voting participation. So while Australia has very close to 100% participation in voting in the legislative elections, the United States is well below 50%. But its participation in other forms of political activities is greater than most of the other nations, with the exception of Canada. So let's take a look at the right to vote, which this is a key thing. Who are the voters? Well, first of all, the right to vote is known as the franchise. And it's expanded over the course of U.S. history to include more and more people. And the first step was the elimination of property qualifications to vote. So very early on in this republic that we live in, we saw that typically white males owning property were the only ones who could vote. So the democracy wasn't as democratic as we like to think. Now, over the years, it has been expanded to include more and more people, with African Americans achieving the franchise with the 15th Amendment in 1870. However, especially in the southern states, there were poll taxes and literacy tests that were specifically put out to limit the franchise. And now this was removed with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but certainly if you see some of the literacy tests, which were incredibly difficult to pass, and the poll taxes, which if you're poor, keeps you away from voting, certainly this was biased against African Americans and poor whites. So certainly there was a good deal of anti-lower class restrictions put in place, especially in the South, prior to 1965. Now, women received the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920, and Native Americans in 1924 with the American Indian Citizenship Act. And finally, and most recently, in 1971, 18-year-olds received the right to vote with the 26th Amendment. And this was in response to their being drafted to go to the Vietnam War, and it was seen as being unfair that those people who could fight for the country could not vote for their representatives. So, despite the fact that there are more eligible voters available to vote in presidential and congressional midterm elections, these election turnouts are consistently low. As we'll see in this slide, figure 11.3 from the book, from 1856 to 2012, we've seen that it has dropped up until about 1920, and then it has remained relatively stable, with presidential elections certainly having a large proportion of available voters voting, but the midterms to a much lesser extent. So these are the individuals who are much more likely to vote, are the ones who are oftentimes much more polemic and extreme in their political views at the legislative level. So let's take a look at political system and turnout. We see that voting laws influences turnout, especially in those countries with compulsory voting laws. It's often over 90%. And certainly, as the book shows, there's a variety of different ways by which this is accomplished. Of course, how you implement them and how you punish people who don't vote matters. Voter registration also plays a major role. Now, the registration rates are much lower in the United States than as in Europe, and this is because the U.S. makes it much more difficult. Now, this is despite the 1993 Motor Voter Law, which provides states the opportunity to give registration when citizens renew their driver's license. In other words, you have to be able to be registered as a voter when you renew your driver's license. However, this is biased against individuals who do not drive. So those who cannot afford a car or are more urban in the structure of their life might not have access to registration. So there is certainly some level of keeping people out of the electoral system through different regulations. Now, when we look at the political system itself, some people argue that the two-party system that we have, and that we've discussed previously in this class, leads to the lack of a meaningful choice in which the voters have less incentive to vote. Now, the thing is arguably in the past it says because both parties, you can't really tell the difference. But now the two parties might be appealing to more extreme perspectives, and this might put people off voting, especially if they do not see connections with their everyday lives. Now, likewise, election schedules and the frequency of them influences whether or not people vote. Now, with our presidential elections being held on Tuesdays, what we see is that this is a work day, and if you can't get out of work, what's the likelihood of you being able to vote? Now, if it were a weekend or a national holiday, this might change the amount of people who vote. Now, it being on Tuesdays in November likely represents the agrarian past of our nation. This is discussed in greater extent in the book. But currently, with the modern work life, it's very difficult for many people to get out to vote. Furthermore, the United States has numerous federal, state, and local elections, so even keeping track of these elections and actually voting in the elections can be quite difficult for your average American. Individual participation and the desire to participate is influenced by multiple factors. So first of all, we've got socioeconomic status, and this is education, income, and occupation. And so what we see is those people who have higher status are more likely to vote. But this doesn't determine whether or not they'll vote. There are other factors that play a role. One of the key ones, is the idea of psychological engagement. People who believe that they're politically efficacious, in other words, they think that their opinions are important and are respected by government officials, are more likely to vote, obviously. Context likely plays a role. Now, within our broader social networks, especially if you belong to organizations or neighborhood connections that you have, if you see the people around you are voting and voting is important for them, then you're more likely to vote. But still, you need the resources to actually participate in the process of voting. And this includes such things as free time, money to be able to take off from work, as well as having basic civic skills, which may or may not be provided in the school system. Now, group characteristics also play a role. we see that the race of an individual, their gender, and their age, this is associated with different levels of participation. The highest participation rates is amongst middle-aged people, especially those who have family. Now, the very young and the very old tend not to be as involved. The very young, likely because they don't see that they have any stake in the political system, and the very old because they can't get themselves to the polls. Likewise, we see that women tend to participate less than men, although it has been increasing over the years. Voter turnout has been higher for women than men in every presidential election since 1984. Of course, political involvement in other parts of the political system are diminished to a great extent when we look at our representatives. And finally, when we consider that the different ethnicities and races of individuals, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos, in comparison, these groups participate less than whites do. So when we think about voting and democracy, what we see is that the lack of voter turnout has incredibly important implications for democratic governance. Specifically, can the government truly uphold the will of the people if the majority of the people don't cast a ballot? In other words, they don't let their will be known. Now, while we know that voting only expresses the will of a portion of the people, and government policy favors those who participate, one of the other questions is, beyond the voting, if you don't raise your voice, no one's going to listen to you. But also, if you don't vote, this is a support into the system, and this might lead people to use other methods which aren't as beneficial to our political system, and ultimately lead to its weakening, even its destruction. So voting is a very important feedback mechanism and release valve for the American public that wants to have a system that serves their needs and their goals. American national government.